I was directed to a video talking about biologist August Weismann, who, in some circles, is regarded as one of the most influential pioneers in evolutionary theory, just behind Darwin himself. This video claims he destroyed Darwin's theory. Let's take a look.
Darwin also thought that if an animal did not use a body part, such as a leg or an eye, its offspring would eventually be born without these. He envisioned animals shedding body parts this way through the law of disuse. For example, he suggested that the eyes of a mole became covered with fur and smaller because the mole did not use them underground.
Darwin's thoughts on the mechanics of evolution were somewhat wrong in this case. He thought that, along with his theory of natural selection, the loss of development observed in the eyes of moles may also be due to disuse. Darwin was not a prophet. He was working with what he knew and could observe and what was believed at the time. His theory of natural selection still stands, even if some minutiae and mechanics have been updated. The theory of disuse was prevalent at the time, so Darwin thought his theory was compatible with it. However, natural selection eventually supplanted the theory of use and disuse. Here's how we now understand how evolution works. If a creature, like a mole, moves underground, it will not need its eyes as much. Body parts take energy to grow and maintain, especially complex ones like eyes. A mole that is born with less developed eyes than its parents, living in an environment where it doesn't need them, will be at an advantage because it's not wasting its body's resources on organs that it doesn't need. Since it has an advantage, it will have a better chance to pass on this mutation of weaker eyes over its competitors. Over the generations, moles with weaker and weaker eyes will generally supplant those that have more developed, but, in this environment, useless eyes. A mole will not lose its eyes because it doesn't use them, but rather because it's a waste of energy to have something that they don't need.
Using or not using a body part has no effect on the DNA of the reproductive cells and cannot be passed on to the next generation. If you put an eye patch on a baby at birth and left it there till adulthood, that person's offspring would still be born with normal eyes. Disuse of a body part has no effect on the next generation.
That's correct. The use, or lack thereof, of a body part will not affect the offspring of an organism. That's the Lamarckian hypothesis, something that's been discredited for a long time. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had the idea that how a creature develops over its lifetime will affect its offspring. Basically, for example, if a creature stretches its neck a lot, its offspring will have longer necks. This idea was presented in 1801 before Darwin was even born. We now know it's a ridiculous idea, but in the beginning of understanding evolutionary concepts, scientists were working in the dark and had to go through several ideas as to how creatures changed. That's what testing and experiments are all about, finding which hypotheses work and which don't. Really? We're going with a masturbation joke? We couldn't have one video where we stay classy? Figures. Lamarckism is actually a good example of the folly of letting ideology override scientific facts. The Soviet Union revived and latched onto Lamarck's ideas because those ideas aligned with their views that work will transform the state in the same way it'll transform species, and felt that Darwin's theories of competition causing evolutionary change was too much like capitalism. Since they didn't like the political idea of capitalism, they ignored one scientific theory for one they liked better, regardless of the evidence. This ended up putting their biological progress back by half a century. And in the end, it didn't even matter. Evolution can say how we got here, and possibly even why we act as we do, but it says nothing about how we should behave.
In the late 19th century, a scientist with a vivid imagination and a butcher knife put the law of disuse to rest and caused an enormous difficulty for Darwin's theory.
A man by the name of August Weismann devised a simple experiment in which he kept cutting off the tails of mice, and he did this for 20-odd generations, and the mice still had tails.
With this simple experiment, the law of disuse was invalidated.
What an experiment like this shows is that Lamarck was wrong, not Darwin. We know that organisms change over time. That was something that Darwin understood and showed in his work. What wasn't known is the mechanics of how these changes occurred. Darwin's work on natural selection basically said that mutations that are advantageous will cause some creatures to be more fit for their environment and will have a better chance to pass on those mutations. We can look back on this early work and laugh, but Weismann's experiments were instrumental. He wanted to show that mutations, not mutilations, were inherited. What should be remembered is that even a failed experiment can teach something. Weismann's work showed that the mechanics of how a creature evolves is not rooted in the creature after it forms. So, variations between generations, which have been observed, must occur sometime before a creature is developed. This led Weismann to his theory of inheritance and germ-line cells. Basically, mutations occur in the sex cells, i.e., sperm and egg for animals, and cause offspring of creatures born from these mutations to have a better or worse chance to survive and breed and pass on these mutations. If you wanted to have mice with reduced tails, instead of cutting off the tails of mice and then allowing them to breed, a better way to go would be to manipulate the environment that they're in. Take the mice of every generation with the smallest tails and only allow them to breed, and continue this with their offspring. Given enough generations, the genetic code for tails in that strain of mice will be modified so that eventually later generations will have noticeably reduced tails. Weismann's work, in fact, strengthened the power of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Instead of natural selection just aiding the effects of disuse, he showed that the idea of disuse was completely incorrect and that all evolution was driven by natural selection.
Scientists continued to explore the law of use, and later realized that this concept was also genetically impossible. Any change to body cells has no effect on the DNA in the reproductive cells, and therefore cannot be passed on to the next generation.
The impact of that experiment and of other skeptical biologists essentially left an explanation for evolution sort of up in the air.
No, it didn't. It showed that one hypothesis for the mechanics of evolution, in this case the Lamarckian hypothesis, was incorrect. Since organisms can be slightly different from their parents, the change must occur before an organism is formed. This understanding led scientists to examine and refine the theory of evolution to match what is observed in the real world and strengthened Darwin's theory of natural selection. That's why the scientific process is such a useful tool. As new and better understanding of the world comes to light, the theories that are closest to the truth will, well, be naturally selected.